A specter is haunting our world, not the one Marx wrote about, but his own ghost, lingering in every economic crisis, every workers' strike, every debate about inequality. Half the world once lived under regimes bearing his name. The other half spent trillions fighting them. Yet the man himself died in obscurity, with fewer than a dozen people at his funeral. Who was Karl Marx? Not the marble statue, not the propaganda poster, but the actual human being who rewrote how we understand money, power, and history itself. May 5th, 1818. Trier, Prussia, a town caught between worlds, once French under Napoleon, now absorbed back into conservative German territories. Heinrich Marx, a successful lawyer, welcomed his third child. The family was Jewish by ancestry, but Heinrich had converted to Lutheranism because Jews couldn't practice law under Prussian rule. Karl's first lesson in how power works: the state decides what you can do publicly. The Marx household was comfortable. Books lined the walls. Enlightenment philosophy filled dinner conversations. Heinrich admired Voltaire and Rousseau and raised his children to question authority. At 17, Karl left for the University of Bonn to study law. It was a disaster. He joined a drinking club, got arrested for drunkenness, fought a duel that left him scarred. His exasperated father transferred him to Berlin. Berlin changed everything. The university was dominated by one towering presence, the recently deceased philosopher Hegel. His ideas were everywhere. History wasn't random. It had a pattern, moving forward through conflict and contradiction toward greater freedom. Marx abandoned law and plunged into philosophy. He joined the young Hegelians, radical students who twisted Hegel's ideas in revolutionary directions. If history moves through contradiction, what contradictions exist now? What needs to be overthrown? In 1841, Marx finished his doctorate. He expected to become a professor, but his radical reputation made that impossible. So he became a journalist instead, editing the Rheinische Zeitung in Cologne. Sharp, fearless, sarcastic. A debate over theft of wood caught his attention. Peasants had traditionally gathered dead wood from forests, but new laws made this illegal. Marx's defense of the peasants revealed something crucial. Abstract ideas about freedom meant nothing if you didn't examine who owned what, who had power, and who didn't. Economics wasn't a side issue. It was the foundation of everything. The government shut down the newspaper in 1843. Marx was unemployed, newly married to Jenny von Westphalen, and convinced Germany had no future for free thinkers. He left for Paris, the capital of revolution, where socialism was in the air, and exiled radicals gathered to plot the overthrow of the old world. Marx arrived at 25, brilliant, arrogant, argumentative, with no money and no career prospects. He had a pregnant wife, a sharp pen, and a growing conviction that he understood something fundamental about how the world worked. He had no idea he was about to meet the man who would become his lifelong collaborator. A young German industrialist's son named Friedrich Engels was coming to Paris, carrying a manuscript about the horrific conditions of factory workers in England. Everything was about to accelerate. Paris, 1844. The city was drunk on ideas. Socialism, communism, anarchism, words that barely existed a decade earlier, now filled pamphlets and underground newspapers. Workers' clubs met in secret. Exiled revolutionaries from Poland, Italy, and Germany plotted in cafes. The French Revolution of 1789 had promised liberty equality, and fraternity. 50 years later, people were still waiting. Marx threw himself into this world. He edited a radical journal, read French socialist theory voraciously, and began developing his own ideas. But he was still thinking like a philosopher, still trapped in abstractions about human nature and alienation. Then Friedrich Engels walked into his life. Engels was everything Marx wasn't: charming, athletic, good with people, the son of a wealthy German textile manufacturer who owned factories in Manchester, England. He'd been sent there to learn the family business, but instead of becoming a good capitalist, he'd wandered into the slums and documented what he saw. The result was a devastating manuscript about working conditions in industrial England. They met in a Paris cafe in August 1844 and talked for 10 days straight. Engels brought something Marx desperately needed: concrete evidence. Not philosophical theories about exploitation, but actual facts. Children working 14-hour days in factories, workers living in cellars flooded with sewage, life expectancy in Manchester's working class districts: 17 years. Engels had the numbers, the stories, the brutal reality of industrial capitalism. Marx brought the theory. He'd been reading Political Economy, Adam Smith, David Ricardo, and he saw what they'd missed. They treated capitalism as natural, eternal, like gravity. Marx saw it as historical, temporary, full of contradictions that would tear it apart. Together, they began forging a new way of thinking about the world. The key insight came from turning Hegel upside down. Hegel said ideas drive history, that human consciousness evolves and shapes material reality. Marx and Engels reversed it. Material reality shapes consciousness. How people produce their food, shelter, and goods determines how they think, what they believe, what seems possible. This was materialism, but not the crude kind that said humans were just atoms bouncing around. It was dialectical materialism. History moves through conflict, through contradictions in how society produces things. Slave societies gave way to feudalism. Feudalism gave way to capitalism. And capitalism, they believed, would give way to something else. Why? Because capitalism created its own gravediggers. Think about it. Capitalism needs workers to operate factories, but it also needs to pay them as little as possible to maximize profit. It needs consumers to buy products, but workers who are barely paid can't consume much. It concentrates wealth in fewer and fewer hands while creating larger and larger masses of propertyless workers. It revolutionizes technology constantly, throwing people out of work. Every solution to one problem creates another problem. Most radically, capitalism creates the working class, a group of people who have nothing to lose but their chains, who are forced to cooperate in factories, who have no stake in the current system. The very structure of capitalism trains and organizes its own opposition. Marx and Engels started writing together. First came The Holy Family, a vicious attack on other young Hegelians who thought revolution happened through better ideas rather than material change. Then, the German Ideology, where they laid out their theory of historical materialism in full. But Paris couldn't last. The Prussian government pressured France to expel dangerous radicals. In 1845, Marx was forced out. He moved to Brussels with Jenny and their growing family. Brussels became the headquarters of a new project. Marx and Engels joined a secret society called the Communist League, workers, artisans, and intellectuals who wanted revolution. not reform. The League asked them to write a statement of principles. They procrastinated for months. Engels wrote a draft in question and answer format. Marx hated it. Too boring, too much like a catechism. It needed drama, urgency, the feel of history thundering forward. In late 1847, as revolution was brewing across Europe, Marx finally sat down to write. He worked in his cramped Brussels apartment, surrounded by books, writing in his tiny, almost illegible handwriting. He began with the most famous opening line in political literature. A specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism. In fewer than 12,000 words, Marx and Engels laid out a vision of history, a theory of capitalism, a program for revolution, and a call to arms that would echo for the next century and beyond. The Communist Manifesto was born. But before it could even be printed, history caught up with them. In February 1848, revolution exploded in Paris. Within weeks, it spread across Europe like wildfire. Governments fell. Monarchs fled. The old order seemed to be collapsing. Marx and Engels rushed back to Germany, ready to join the revolution they'd predicted. They had no idea how quickly it would all fall apart. 1848, the year Europe caught fire. It started in Sicily in January, then jumped to Paris in February. King Louis Philippe fled disguised as Mr. Smith. Within weeks, revolutions erupted in Berlin, Vienna, Budapest, Prague, Milan, Venice. Over 50 countries experienced uprisings. The conservative order that had ruled since Napoleon's defeat seemed finished. The Communist Manifesto hit the streets in late February, printed in London just as the revolutions began. Timing couldn't have been better, or worse. Better because it seemed prophetic. Worse because events moved so fast that nobody had time to read a 30-page pamphlet. Marx and Engels rushed to Cologne, where Marx immediately launched a newspaper, the Neue Rheinische Zeitung. He used his inheritance, what little remained, to fund it. Every day he published articles supporting the revolution, attacking the Prussian government, pushing the movement leftward. But Marx faced a problem. The revolution wasn't following his script. The manifesto had predicted that workers would rise up against capitalists. Instead, 1848 was led by middle-class liberals who wanted constitutional government and national independence, not the overthrow of capitalism. Workers joined in, sure, but so did peasants, students, shopkeepers. The class lines Marx expected were blurry. In France, the confusion was total. After overthrowing the king, revolutionaries established a provisional government that included socialists. They created national workshops, government jobs programs for unemployed workers. It looked like socialism was actually beginning. Then reality hit. The workshops cost money. The government raised taxes on peasants to pay for them. Peasants, furious at paying for urban workers, voted for conservatives. In June, the government shut down the workshops. Workers built barricades in Paris. The army massacred them. 3,000 dead in 4 days. Marx watched in horror. The revolution was eating itself. The middle class, terrified of worker radicalism, sided with the old order. By summer, conservative forces were regrouping everywhere. In Germany, the story was similar. The Frankfurt Assembly met to write a constitution, but spent months debating while the old monarchies rebuilt their strength. When push came to shove, the liberals chose order over revolution. They were more afraid of workers below than kings above. Marx's newspaper became increasingly radical. as the revolution failed. He attacked the liberals viciously, calling them cowards and traitors. He urged workers to arm themselves to prepare for the next round. The Prussian government finally had enough. In May 1849, they expelled him from Germany. Marx fled to Paris, but the French government, now conservative, expelled him too. He had one option left: London. He arrived in August 1849, thinking it would be temporary, a few months, maybe a year, until revolution reignited. He would spend the rest of his life there. So what had 1848 proved? For Marx, everything and nothing. The revolutions failed, yes, but they confirmed his basic analysis. When crisis hit, the system cracked. Class conflicts erupted. The middle class chose property over progress. Workers fought, but lacked organization and consciousness. The manifesto itself had laid out the theory with brutal clarity. History, it argued, was the history of class struggles. Freeman and slave, lord and serf, capitalist and worker, oppressor and oppressed in constant conflict. Capitalism, the manifesto explained, was revolutionary. It destroyed all old social relations, turned everything into commodities, created a world market. All that is solid melts into air. All that is holy is profaned. It was the most productive system ever created, but also the most unstable. Why? Because capitalism's success created its failure. It concentrated wealth while expanding the working class. It needed constant growth but created periodic crises. It socialized production, thousands working together in factories, while keeping ownership private. The contradiction would eventually explode. The solution? Workers of the world unite, overthrow the bourgeoisie, abolish private property and the means of production. Create a society where production serves human needs, not profit. The manifesto ended with the most famous rallying cry in political history. Workers of the world, unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains. But in 1849, as Marx settled into London exile, those words rang hollow. The workers had lost. The chains remained. And Marx was broke, unemployed, with a growing family and no prospects. The revolutionary moment had passed. Now came the hard part: surviving, studying, and preparing for the next one. Marx was 31 years old. He'd been expelled from 3 countries, burned through his inheritance, and seen his predictions fail. Most people would have given up, found a job, settled down. Instead, Marx went to the British Museum and began the research that would consume the next 2 decades of his life. If capitalism was doomed to collapse, he needed to understand exactly how it worked. Every gear, every contradiction, every law of motion. He was going to write the Bible of capitalism's destruction. It would nearly destroy him first. London, 1849. Marx arrived in the world's richest city as a penniless refugee. No job, no prospects, no legal right to work. Just a wife, 3 children, and a maid named Helene Demuth, who'd been with Jenny's family since childhood and would stay with the Marx family for the rest of their lives. They moved into 2 rooms at 64 Dean Street, Soho. The neighborhood was a slum. Narrow streets, open sewers, cholera epidemics. Irish immigrants, Italian political exiles, prostitutes, criminals. The rooms were so small that when guests visited, they had to sit on the bed because there was nowhere else. This would be Marx's life for the next decade. Grinding poverty, constant debt, illness, death, and the most intensive research project of the 19th century. The British Museum became his sanctuary. Every morning at 9, Marx would leave Dean Street and walk to the museum's reading room. He'd sit at the same desk, desk G7, working until 7 in the evening, day after day, year after year. What was he doing? Reading everything: political economy, factory reports, government blue books on working conditions, histories of money and banking, obscure medieval texts on trade. He filled notebook after notebook with excerpts, calculations, observations. He was building a complete theory of capitalism from the ground up. But he also had to eat. Marx made money the only way he could: journalism. He became the London correspondent for the New York Tribune, then the largest circulation newspaper in America. He wrote hundreds of articles on British politics, European revolutions, the Crimean War, Indian Rebellion, slavery in America. The work was tedious. The pay was terrible. And often Engels had to ghostwrite articles when Marx was too sick or overwhelmed. Engels, meanwhile, had returned to Manchester to work in his father's textile factory. He hated it, spending his days as a capitalist manager when he wanted to be a revolutionary, but it kept him alive. More importantly, it kept Marx alive. Engels sent money constantly. £5 here, 10 there. Emergency loans when the landlord threatened eviction, or the pawnbroker wouldn't take any more of Jenny's possessions. Without Engels, Marx would have starved. It's that simple. Life at Dean Street was a nightmare. Marx and Jenny kept having children, 7 in total, and they kept dying. Their 1-year-old son, Heinrich, died in 1850. Their daughter, Franziska, died in 1852, not even a year old. 8-year-old Edgar, Marx's favorite child, died in 1855. The family couldn't afford doctors or medicine. A Prussian spy who visited the apartment in 1852 wrote a report describing the chaos. Furniture broken and covered in dust, everything pawned or sold, children playing on the floor with broken toys. Marx sitting at a table covered in papers and books, smoking constantly, coughing, writing. One never finds a clean or usable piece of furniture, the spy wrote. Everything is filthy and covered with dust. Jenny Marx, born a baroness, took it hardest. She'd given up everything for Karl: wealth, status, family approval. Now she was darning clothes by candlelight, borrowing money from neighbors, watching her children die. She had a nervous breakdown in 1851, then another in 1856. The letters she wrote during this period are devastating. She contemplated suicide. She begged Marx to find regular work, anything. He couldn't or wouldn't. The research consumed him. Marx believed he'd discovered something unprecedented: the laws of motion of capitalism itself. Just as Newton had discovered the laws of physical motion, Marx was uncovering the economic laws that governed modern society. This wasn't just politics or philosophy anymore. It was science. The key insight was labor. Where does profit come from? Classical economists like Adam Smith and David Ricardo had said that labor creates value. A coat is valuable because someone had to work to make it, but they couldn't explain profit. If workers are paid the full value of what they produce, where does the capitalist's profit come from? Marx's answer: workers aren't paid for what they produce. They're paid for their labor power, their capacity to work. And here's the trick: labor power costs less to maintain than it produces. Think about it this way. A worker needs, say, 6 hours of labor value to survive: food, shelter, clothes. But the capitalist makes them work 12 hours. Those extra 6 hours, that's surplus value. That's where profit comes from. Not from trade, not from innovation, not from risk-taking, from unpaid labor. This was exploitation, but not in a moral sense, in a structural sense. Even a kind capitalist who personally liked his workers still had to extract surplus value, or he'd be driven out of business by competitors who did. The system itself demanded it, and this led to capitalism's fundamental contradiction. To maximize profit, capitalists had to minimize wages and maximize working hours. But workers were also consumers. If you paid them too little, they couldn't buy the products they made. Overproduction, crisis, collapse. Marx filled notebooks with this analysis. He studied factory reports showing how machinery displaced workers. He tracked how crises happened every 10 years, like clockwork. He documented the falling rate of profit as competition forced capitalists to invest more in machines and less in labor, even though labor was the source of profit. It was brilliant, obsessive work. It was also killing him. Marx's health was terrible. He had chronic liver problems, carbuncles, massive boils that erupted all over his body, especially when he was stressed. They were so painful, he sometimes couldn't sit at his desk. He treated them with arsenic, which probably made things worse. He couldn't sleep. He smoked constantly, dozens of cigars a day. He drank too much coffee, ate irregularly. In 1857, he thought capitalism was finally going to collapse. A financial crisis started in America and spread to Europe. Marx worked frantically, convinced revolution was imminent. He wrote 800 pages in 7 months, drafts that wouldn't be published until the 1940s, when scholars would call them the Grundrisse, the rough draft of his economic theory. But the crisis passed. Capitalism survived. Marx had to keep working. The isolation was crushing. Most of the revolutionaries Marx had known in 1848 had given up, taken regular jobs, made their peace with the system. The ones who remained were often cranks or sectarians, endlessly splitting into smaller and smaller groups. Marx fought with almost all of them. He could be vicious in arguments, accusing former comrades of betrayal over tiny theoretical differences. Jenny wanted him to finish the book, get it published, maybe earn some money and recognition. But Marx was a perfectionist. One more chapter, one more revision, one more year of research. The project kept expanding. He'd planned one book, then realized he needed 3, then 6. In 1859, he published a contribution to the critique of political economy, essentially an introduction to his larger work. It sold poorly. Critics barely noticed it. The few revolutionaries who read it found it too dense, too theoretical. Marx kept going. By 1863, things had gotten slightly better. An inheritance from Jenny's mother eased the immediate poverty. They moved to a better house in Kentish Town. The children were older. Marx's health improved a bit. And finally, the manuscript was taking shape. In 1867, after nearly 2 decades of work, Marx finished the first volume of Das Kapital. He dedicated it to Wilhelm Wolff, a friend from the 1848 days who died in exile. Engels called it the most terrible missile that has yet been hurled at the heads of the bourgeoisie. Marx was 49 years old. He'd spent half his life on this book. It would change everything, but not immediately, not the way he hoped. The first printing was small. Reviews were sparse. Sales were weak. Most revolutionaries found it too theoretical. Most economists ignored it entirely. Marx's magnum opus, the work that would eventually reshape political thought worldwide, landed with barely a whisper. He still had 2 more volumes to write. He never finished them. Engels would have to assemble them from Marx's notes after his death. But Volume 1 of Capital was out in the world. The bomb was ticking. It would take decades to explode, but when it did, it would level empires. Das Kapital. Capital. The title itself was a provocation, not a critique of capitalism or the problems of modern economy, just capital, as if Marx were writing the definitive text on the very thing he wanted to destroy, the way an anatomist might title a book, The Human Body, before dissecting it. The subtitle told you what you were in for, a critique of political economy. This wasn't just economics. It was a critique of how economists thought about economics, a dismantling of the entire intellectual apparatus that justified capitalism. Volume 1, published in 1867, ran over 700 pages in German. Dense, difficult, sometimes brilliant, sometimes impenetrable. Marx moved between abstract theory and vivid descriptions of factory conditions, between mathematical formulas and bitter sarcasm. The book had footnotes longer than most people's chapters, references to obscure medieval texts, sudden digressions into the history of money or the working day. It was not an easy read. It wasn't meant to be. Marx opened with the commodity, the basic cell, the building block of capitalism, a coat, a bushel of wheat, a chair. Simple objects, bought and sold every day. But these objects contained a mystery. How do we measure their value? The answer seemed obvious. Supply and demand, right? If everyone wants coats and few exist, prices go up. But Marx dug deeper. Why can you exchange one coat for 20 bushels of wheat? What makes them equivalent? There must be something common to both, some substance that allows comparison. That substance was labor. A coat takes X hours to produce. 20 bushels of wheat take the same X hours. Labor time was the common measure, the hidden substance of value. Not just any labor, socially necessary labor, the average amount of time it takes to produce something, given the current level of technology and skill. This was the labor theory of value, and Marx didn't invent it. Adam Smith and David Ricardo had versions of it, but Marx took it further, deeper, into darker territory. Because if labor creates value, where does profit come from? This was the question that haunted classical economics. Ricardo knew it was a problem, but couldn't solve it. If you pay workers the full value of what they produce, there's no profit left for the capitalist. But if you don't pay them full value, you're admitting capitalism runs on theft. Marx's solution was elegant and damning. Workers don't sell their labor. They sell their labor power, their capacity to work. And here's the magic trick of capitalism. Labor power is a unique commodity because it can create more value than it costs. Think of it this way. A worker needs the equivalent of 6 hours of labor to survive, to buy food, pay rent, clothe themselves. The capitalist pays them for 6 hours, but the contract says they have to work 12 hours. Those extra 6 hours, that's surplus value. That's profit. The worker is paid for their capacity to work, but the capitalist owns everything they produce. This wasn't exploitation in a moral sense, like a thief stealing your wallet. It was structural exploitation built into the wage relation itself. The capitalist and worker could both be perfectly honest, following all the rules, and exploitation still happened. In fact, it had to happen. Without surplus value extraction, there was no profit. Without profit, there was no capitalism. Marx called this unpaid labor, and he showed it wasn't limited to 12-hour factory shifts. It was everywhere. Every business, every transaction every profit margin, all rested on getting workers to produce more value than they received in wages. But Marx didn't stop there. He traced the implications with ruthless logic. First implication, the working day. Capitalists wanted to maximize surplus value, so they pushed for longer hours. 12 hours became 14, became 16. Children worked through the night in factories. People died at their machines. The chapters on the working day in Capital are horror stories. Parliamentary reports describing 7-year-olds in lace factories working from 2 a.m. to 8 p.m. Workers in bakeries sleeping in dough rooms crawling with rats. Potters dying from lead poisoning before age 30. This wasn't cruelty. It was logic. If you wanted to compete, you had to extract more surplus value. And the easiest way was to extend the working day. Eventually, workers fought back. Unions formed, strikes erupted. Legislation limited hours. So, capitalists found another method: intensification. Make workers work harder, faster, more efficiently in the same time. Speed up the machines. Remove breaks. Introduce scientific management. More surplus value per hour. Second implication, machinery. Marx devoted huge sections of Capital to analyzing machinery and its effects. Machines seemed like progress, and they were, in a sense. They multiplied productivity enormously. But under capitalism, they were weapons against workers. Why? Because machines replaced labor. A textile machine that did the work of 50 weavers threw 49 weavers out of work. This created a reserve army of labor, unemployed workers desperate for any job, willing to work for less, keeping wages down. Capitalists didn't introduce machines to help workers. They introduced them to reduce dependence on workers, to break their bargaining power, to increase surplus value extraction. Marx described factories where children fed machines, where workers were maimed because safety cost money, where entire craft skills were destroyed overnight by automation. And the cruel irony: the very machines that could liberate humanity from toil became instruments of oppression because they were privately owned. Third implication, accumulation. Capital had to grow or die. The capitalist who didn't reinvest profits, who didn't expand, would be destroyed by competitors who did. So surplus value got plowed back into more means of production, more factories, more machines. Capital accumulated. But this created problems. As capitalists invested more in machinery and less in labor, Marx called this the rising organic composition of capital. The rate of profit tended to fall. Why? Because only living labor created new value. Machines just transferred their existing value to products. More machines relative to workers meant less surplus value relative to total investment. Capitalists tried to counter this. They intensified exploitation, expanded into new markets, destroyed competitors, pioneered new technologies. But these were temporary fixes. The fundamental contradiction remained. Capitalism needed profit. Profit came from surplus value. Surplus value came from exploiting workers. But competition forced capitalists to replace workers with machines, which undermined the source of profit. This was the law of the falling rate of profit, and Marx believed it would eventually strangle capitalism. Fourth implication, crisis. Capitalism was inherently unstable. It produced too much. Overproduction crises, where warehouses filled with goods nobody could afford to buy because workers were paid too little. It concentrated wealth in fewer hands while creating masses of poor workers. It revolutionized production constantly, throwing entire industries into chaos. It needed constant expansion, but eventually would run out of new markets to conquer. Marx documented the history of crises: 1825, 1836, 39, 1847, 1857, like clockwork. Every decade or so, the system seized up. Banks failed, factories closed, unemployment soared. Then slowly, painfully, it recovered, only to crash again. These weren't accidents or failures of regulation. They were built into capitalism's DNA. The system had to grow, but growth created the conditions for collapse. Fifth implication: the proletariat. Capitalism created its own gravediggers. By concentrating workers in factories, by stripping away all property and security, by forcing cooperation and discipline, capitalism trained and organized the working class. Workers learned solidarity through struggle. They learned organization through unions. They learned their power through strikes, and they had nothing to lose. The peasant might cling to his plot of land. The artisan might dream of his own shop. But the proletarian owned nothing but labor power. No property tied them to the system. They could only win by overthrowing it. Marx believed this was inevitable, not because of moral outrage, but because of structural contradictions. Capitalism created the conditions for its own destruction. Masses of exploited workers, recurring crises, falling profit rates, the socialization of production combined with private appropriation. Eventually, the workers would seize the means of production and reorganize society rationally, producing for need rather than profit. This was the expropriation of the expropriators. The expropriators, capitalists who'd expropriated land and tools from workers, would themselves be expropriated, and it would be easier than the original theft because production was already socialized. The working class just had to make ownership match reality. Capital Volume 1 ended with this prophecy. The knell of capitalist private property sounds. The expropriators are expropriated. But there was a problem, a huge problem that Marx knew but didn't fully solve. What came next? He described capitalism in excruciating detail, 800 pages across 3 volumes, thousands more in notes and drafts. But communism, the society that would replace capitalism. A few scattered paragraphs, vague gestures, confident assertions that the working class would figure it out. This omission would haunt Marxism forever. In trying to build the alternative, revolutionaries would have no blueprint, only principles. The results would be both inspiring and catastrophic. Marx planned 2 more volumes. Volume 2 on the circulation of capital. Volume 3 on the capitalist system as a whole. He worked on them for years, but never finished. His health collapsed again. The carbuncles returned. He couldn't concentrate. He traveled for medical treatment, to spas in Germany, to the seaside in England, even to Algeria, in a desperate attempt to escape the European winter. Engels begged him to finish. Just get something down, even if it wasn't perfect. Publishers waited. Revolutionaries wanted guidance, but Marx couldn't do it. He kept revising, rethinking, adding more research. He died with the manuscripts unfinished. Engels would spend the next decade editing Marx's notes into publishable form, assembling Volume 2 in 1885 and Volume 3 in 1894. But Volume 1 was enough. It was out there, spreading slowly but surely. Translated into Russian in 1872. The censors approved it because they thought it was too theoretical to be dangerous. Translated into French in installments. into English, finally, in 1887, after Marx's death. The book that Marx wrote in poverty and obscurity, the book that barely sold on publication, would become one of the most influential texts in human history. It would inspire revolutions, shape economies, justify dictatorships, liberate colonies, and provide the intellectual foundation for movements affecting billions of people. But in 1867, when it was published, Marx was just a debt-ridden exile with liver problems and a book nobody read. History moves slowly. Then suddenly, it doesn't. September 28th, 1864, St. Martin's Hall, London. 2,000 workers packed into the auditorium. French, German, Italian, Polish, British. Trade unionists, radicals, refugees, revolutionaries. They'd gathered to form something unprecedented, an international organization of the working class. Marx attended reluctantly. He'd grown skeptical of activism, preferring his research to what he called sectarian quackery. But curiosity got the better of him. Within an hour, he was elected to the General Council. Within weeks, he'd written the organization's founding address and rules. The International Workingmen's Association, later called the First International, would consume the next 8 years of Marx's life. It was his one sustained attempt to turn theory into practice, to build an actual movement that could challenge capitalism. It almost killed him, and it definitely killed the organization. The International was chaos from the start. It brought together people who agreed on almost nothing except that capitalism was bad. British trade unionists wanted better wages and working conditions. French proudhonists believed in worker cooperatives and mutual credit. German socialists followed various competing theories. Polish nationalists wanted independence. Italian Republicans followed Mazzini. And lurking in the background were the anarchists, led by Mikhail Bakunin, who wanted to abolish the state immediately. Marx became the organization's de facto leader, though he held no official title beyond General Council member. He wrote addresses, drafted resolutions, managed correspondence with sections across Europe. It was exhausting work that paid nothing and took time away from capital. But it mattered. For the first time, workers across national boundaries were organizing together. When British workers struck, French workers sent money. When governments cracked down on unions in one country, workers in other countries protested. The International gave the labor movement international solidarity. The organization grew rapidly. By 1870, it claimed millions of members, though the numbers were inflated. Many trade unions affiliated loosely without really committing. Still, governments were terrified. Police infiltrated meetings. Newspapers warned of vast conspiracies. The mere existence of the International seemed to prove that Marx's prediction was coming true. Workers of different nations had more in common with each other than with their own ruling classes. Marx used the International as a platform to push his ideas. He argued against the reformists who thought capitalism could be tamed through legislation. He argued against the Proudhonists who wanted cooperatives within capitalism rather than revolution. He argued against the anarchists who wanted immediate abolition of the state without understanding how production would be reorganized. The conflicts were vicious. Marx's polemics were brutal. He accused opponents of betraying the working class, of ignorance, of being police agents. He maneuvered to exclude groups he disagreed with, packed meetings with supporters, used procedural tricks to win votes. This wasn't just ideological purity. Marx genuinely believed that wrong theory led to failed practice. If workers wasted energy on cooperatives that would inevitably fail under capitalist competition, they'd miss the window for revolution. If anarchists smashed the state prematurely, chaos would result and reaction would win. Theory mattered because it guided action. The test came in 1870. War broke out between France and Prussia. The International faced its first major crisis. Should workers support their own governments or maintain international solidarity? Marx argued for neutrality. This was a war between two reactionary states, Napoleon III's empire versus Bismarck's expanding Prussia. Workers had no stake in either side winning. They should refuse to fight, maintain solidarity across borders, wait for opportunities the war might create. But when France collapsed and Paris rose in revolution, everything changed. March 18th, 1871, the Paris Commune. After France's humiliating defeat, the government tried to disarm the National Guard, working-class militia units that had defended Paris during the siege. The guards refused. Soldiers sent to seize the cannons fraternized with the workers instead. The government fled. Paris declared itself independent. For 72 days, workers ran Paris. They held elections. They abolished night work in bakeries. They declared the separation of church and state. They made education free. They said elected officials should earn workers' wages. They talked about requisitioning abandoned factories and running them collectively. Marx watched from London with intense excitement. Here it was, finally, a working-class government. Not theory, but reality. The proletariat in power. But he also watched with dread because he knew how it would end. The Commune made mistakes. It didn't seize the Bank of France when it had the chance. It spent too much time on symbolic issues and not enough on military preparation. It remained too democratic, too hesitant, too respectful of old rules. The government forces regrouping at Versailles were playing by different rules. In May, the army entered Paris. What followed was slaughter. The bloody week, 7 days of massacre. Communards fought from behind barricades. The army burned buildings, executed prisoners, killed anyone suspected of sympathy. When it ended, estimates ranged from 10 to 30,000 dead. Thousands more were imprisoned or deported to New Caledonia. Marx wrote The Civil War in France immediately, a passionate defense of the Commune published as an address from the International. He praised the Commune as the first example of the dictatorship of the proletariat, the form that working-class rule would take. Not a dictatorship in the modern sense, but rule by the working class as a whole, smashing the old state apparatus and replacing it with something radically democratic. The pamphlet made Marx famous or infamous. Newspapers across Europe blamed the International for the Commune. Suddenly, Marx wasn't an obscure economist, but a dangerous revolutionary leader. His name was in headlines. Governments demanded his arrest. The myth of Marx as the Red Terror doctor was born. It was ironic. The International had barely been involved in the Commune. Marx had no communication with Paris during the uprising, but by defending it afterward, he became its symbol. The attention destroyed the International. Governments cracked down. Sections were banned, members were arrested, and internally, the conflicts that had simmered for years exploded. Bakunin and the anarchists accused Marx of authoritarianism. They said he wanted a centralized state that would oppress workers as much as capitalism did. They advocated immediate abolition of all government, complete freedom, voluntary association. Marx saw this as romantic nonsense. You couldn't just abolish the state and expect everything to work out. Who would coordinate production? How would you prevent counter-revolution? The working class needed state power, temporarily, to reorganize society. Only after classes had been abolished could the state wither away. The conflict became personal. Marx accused Bakunin of being a Russian agent, of embezzling money, of forming secret conspiracies within the International. Bakunin accused Marx of wanting to be a dictator, of caring only about German workers, of betraying anarchist principles. At the 1872 Congress in The Hague, Marx made his move. He had Bakunin expelled from the International. He pushed through resolutions requiring sections to accept the need for working class political parties and state power. Then, in a bizarre tactical maneuver, he had the General Council relocated to New York, effectively killing the organization by removing it from Europe. Why? Because Marx preferred the International dead on his terms, rather than alive and controlled by anarchists. Better to destroy what he'd built than see it corrupted. The International limped along for a few more years in New York before formally dissolving in 1876. Marx's great political experiment had failed. But had it? The International planted seeds. It established the principle of international working class solidarity. It showed that workers could organize across borders. It created networks and relationships that would later form the basis for socialist parties across Europe. And the memory of the Paris Commune, brutally suppressed but never forgotten, would inspire revolutionaries for the next century. Marx drew lessons from the experience. He became more convinced that revolution required organization, not just spontaneity, that the working class needed its own political party to contest for power, that the bourgeois state couldn't be reformed but had to be smashed and replaced, that the transition to communism would be longer and more difficult than he'd initially thought. He also grew more pessimistic. After the International collapsed, he withdrew from organizing. He was in his 50s, exhausted, sick. His wife's health was failing. His daughters were grown and causing their own dramas. Eleanor becoming an actress and socialist organizer. Laura married to a French socialist. Jenny married to a French journalist. Marx returned to his studies. He learned Russian so he could read about the peasant communes. He studied anthropology, looking at pre-capitalist societies. He filled notebooks with observations about colonialism, about gender relations, about ecological destruction caused by capitalism. But he never finished Volume 2 or 3 of Capital. The energy wasn't there. The carbuncles returned constantly. He couldn't concentrate. He traveled for his health, but nothing helped. Engels kept pushing him. Just finish it. Get something published. The movement needs it. Marx kept promising next year, next month, soon. The work of the International years had taken too much out of him. 8 years of meetings, letters, conflicts, late nights writing addresses and resolutions, all while trying to finish Capital, all while living in poverty, all while his body broke down. In December 1881, Jenny Marx died after a long illness. Marx was too sick to attend the funeral. He sat in the next room, coughing, unable to move. 14 months later, he would follow her. Behind the revolutionary theorist, Behind the economic analyst who spent decades dissecting capitalism was a man, flawed, complicated, often contradictory. To understand Marx's ideas, you need to understand the human being who produced them. And that human being was a mess. Start with the obvious irony. The man who wrote about liberating the working class never held a working class job in his life. He was born into the bourgeoisie, married into minor aristocracy, and spent his entire adult life dependent on others for money. He theorized revolution from libraries and study rooms, not factory floors. This matters because Marx's entire worldview was shaped by his position as an intellectual, someone whose labor produced ideas, not commodities. He experienced capitalism as alienation, as the frustration of being unable to publish his thoughts, as the indignity of having to write newspaper articles for money when he wanted to write revolutionary theory. His alienation was real, but it wasn't the alienation of a textile worker breathing cotton dust for 14 hours a day. Marx knew this. It ate at him. He felt guilty about his dependence on Engels, guilty that he couldn't provide for his family, guilty that his children suffered while he wrote about ending suffering. But he never seriously considered getting a regular job. The work was too important. The research couldn't be interrupted. Jenny Marx paid the price. She was remarkable, educated, intelligent, politically committed. She could have married into security and status. Instead, she chose Karl and got poverty, exile, dead children, and decades of uncertainty. Her letters reveal the toll. In 1850, with 3 children under 5, she wrote about contemplating suicide. In 1852, after their daughter Franziska died, she described the baby's death in harrowing detail. No money for a doctor, no money for a coffin. Borrowing £2 from a French refugee to bury their child. In 1856, when another child died, she had a complete breakdown. Jenny was angry often. Angry at Karl for not finding regular work. Angry at the creditors who hounded them. Angry at the revolutionaries who promised support but delivered nothing. Angry at herself for her anger. She'd internalized the idea that a wife should support her husband's genius, no matter the cost. But the cost was staggering. Marx loved her, certainly. His letters to her are tender, affectionate, sometimes passionate. But he also took her for granted. She managed the household, dealt with creditors, pawned her possessions, maintained connections with her wealthy relatives, all while Marx sat in the British Museum reading about surplus value. The children suffered too. 3 died in infancy or childhood. The survivors, Jenny, Laura, and Eleanor, grew up in poverty and chaos. They were brilliant girls, educated and political, but their lives were shaped by their father's choices. Jenny Jr. became involved in radical politics, married a French socialist named Charles Longuet. She died of cancer at 38. Laura married Paul Lafargue, another French socialist. They killed themselves together in 1911, a double suicide pact when they were elderly and feared becoming burdens. Eleanor, called Tussie, was perhaps the most tragic. She was Marx's favorite, the one most like him intellectually. She became a socialist organizer, a talented actress, a translator. She fell in love with Edward Aveling, a charming, manipulative fraud who lived off her earnings and had affairs behind her back. In 1898, at 43, she killed herself with prussic acid. Some think Aveling murdered her, but most evidence points to suicide. 3 daughters, 2 suicides, 1 dead at 38. Grim inheritance for the man who wanted to liberate humanity. Then there's Helene de Muth, Lenchen, as they called her. She came to the Marx household as Jenny's maid when Jenny married Karl. She stayed for nearly 40 years, through all the poverty and chaos, cooking, cleaning, managing what little money they had, nursing the children, keeping the family afloat. In 1851, Lenchen became pregnant. The father was Karl Marx. This fact, confirmed by historians, long suppressed by Marxist hagiographers, reveals something crucial about Marx's character. Here was the man writing about exploitation, about how capitalism turned human relations into commodity relations, about liberating women from patriarchal oppression. And he impregnated his servant. The baby, Frederick, was given away to a working-class family. Marx never publicly acknowledged him. Engels took responsibility for the child, a cover story to protect Marx's reputation. Frederick grew up knowing nothing of his real father until Engels, on his deathbed, told Eleanor the truth. What do we do with this? Marx's defenders argue it was a private failing that doesn't invalidate his public work. His critics see it as revealing fundamental hypocrisy, the revolutionary who couldn't live by his own principles. Both miss something important. Marx was human, brilliant, yes, dedicated to his work, absolutely, but also capable of cruelty, of selfishness, of letting his grand vision excuse personal failings. The man who analyzed capitalism's exploitation with unmatched clarity exploited the woman who kept his household running. Marx's relationship with Engels was the most important in his life and the strangest. On the surface, they were opposites. Marx was Jewish, intellectual, chaotic, constantly broke. Engels was Protestant, practical, organized, financially successful. Marx was abrasive and argumentative. Engels was charming and diplomatic. But they shared the fundamental things: brilliance, political commitment, and a friendship that transcended everything else. Engels supported Marx financially for 4 decades. Not small amounts, thousands of pounds over the years, equivalent to hundreds of thousands today. He ghost-wrote Marx's articles when deadlines loomed. He edited Marx's manuscripts. He defended Marx's ideas against critics. He managed Marx's political battles. Why? Not from weakness or dependency. Engels was formidable in his own right. He wrote brilliant books, ran a successful business, organized political movements. He supported Marx because he believed in the work, because he saw something in Marx that was worth preserving even at great personal cost. The correspondence between them runs to thousands of letters. They're extraordinary documents, discussing everything from economic theory to gossip about other socialists, from world events to personal troubles. Marx would write to Engels about carbuncles on his penis. Engels would reply with medical advice and money. It was that kind of friendship. Engels sacrificed his own theoretical work to support Marx's. He spent 20 years in Manchester managing a textile factory he hated, living a double life, respectable bourgeois by day, revolutionary by night. He had 2 long-term relationships with Irish working-class women, Mary and then Lizzie Burns, whom he never married because he rejected bourgeois marriage conventions. When Mary died suddenly, Marx's letter of condolence was curt and quickly turned to his own financial problems. It was one of the few times they seriously quarreled. Marx could be a difficult friend. He was demanding, sometimes insensitive, often self-absorbed. When people disagreed with him, he could turn vicious. Former comrades became dogs or idiots or police spies in his letters. He held grudges for years. He could be petty, mocking people's appearances, their intelligence, their backgrounds. Yet people who knew him personally often described him differently. His daughters adored him, despite everything. He played with them, told them stories, supported their education and ambitions in ways unusual for the time. Friends described him as warm, funny, generous with his time, if not his money. Wilhelm Liebknecht, who knew Marx in London, wrote about long walks on Hampstead Heath, where Marx would discourse on everything from philosophy to poetry to natural history. Marx loved literature. He read Shakespeare constantly, could quote long passages from memory. He read Greek drama in the original, adored Aeschylus. He read novels voraciously, Balzac, Cervantes, Dickens. He believed that Balzac's novels taught more about capitalism than all the economics textbooks. He thought Cervantes understood the transition from feudalism to capitalism better than most historians. He wrote poetry in his youth, terrible, overwrought romantic poetry that Jenny preserved. He wrote some humorous verse later that showed more talent. He had ambitions of writing a play about the Reformation, about the peasant leader, Thomas Mincer. He never finished it, like so much else. Marx drank too much, smoked too much, didn't exercise, ate irregularly. His health problems were partly constitutional, but partly self-inflicted. The carbuncles that plagued him were likely worsened by stress, poor diet, and overwork. His liver problems came from too much alcohol and too little sleep. He was obsessive about his work to the point of self-destruction. He couldn't leave things unfinished, but also couldn't finish things. He'd work himself into exhaustion, then collapse for weeks. He'd promise publishers manuscripts and miss deadlines by years. Volume 2 of Kapital went through multiple complete rewrites. Volume 3 was never finished at all, just mountains of notes that Engels had to assemble posthumously. Why couldn't he finish? Partly perfectionism. Partly the scope of the project kept expanding as he researched more. Partly because finishing meant facing the question, what if the book didn't change anything? What if all this suffering, all this sacrifice was for nothing? The last years were decline. After Jenny died in December 1881, Marx lost his anchor. His health deteriorated rapidly. He developed bronchitis that turned into pleurisy. His daughter, Jenny Jr., died in January 1883, which broke something in him. Engels visited constantly, trying to keep Marx's spirits up, trying to get him to work, trying to organize the manuscripts. But Marx was done. He spent his last weeks in an armchair, unable to sleep lying down, coughing constantly, drifting in and out of consciousness. On March 14, 1883, Engels came to visit and found Marx in his chair, dead. He'd slipped away peacefully, probably from a pulmonary abscess or heart failure. He was 64 years old. 11 people attended his funeral at Highgate Cemetery in London. Engels gave the eulogy. He compared Marx to Darwin, someone who discovered the laws governing human history just as Darwin discovered the laws governing biological evolution. He said that Marx's name and work would endure through the centuries. He was right. Though Marx would have been horrified by much of what was done in his name. But that's the next part of the story. What happened when Marx's ideas escaped his control and entered history on their own terms? The man was dead. The ideas were just beginning to live. When Marx died in 1883, capitalism was booming. The Industrial Revolution was in full swing. European empires were carving up Africa and Asia. The working class was getting better off in many places, not worse. The revolution Marx predicted seemed further away than ever. 34 years later, the Russian Empire collapsed, and a Marxist party seized power in the largest country on earth. Within another 30 years, a third of humanity lived under governments claiming to follow Marx's ideas. The obscure economist who died with a dozen people at his funeral became the most influential political thinker of the 20th century. How did this happen? And what did it mean? Start with Germany. Even before Marx died, German socialists were organizing the first successful Marxist political party, the Social Democratic Party of Germany, the SPD. They combined Marx's theory with practical politics, running candidates, winning seats in parliament, organizing unions, publishing newspapers. Engels watched this anxiously. He worried they were becoming too respectable, too reformist. Marx had always said you couldn't vote your way to socialism. The bourgeois state had to be smashed. But the SPD was becoming part of the system, winning concessions, building a mass movement through elections. Still, by 1890, the SPD was the largest socialist party in the world, with hundreds of thousands of members. They claimed to be Marxist, even if Marx might have disputed what that meant. When Engels died in 1895, the SPD gave him a hero's funeral. Marxism had arrived as a political force. But what kind of force? That's where things got complicated. In Germany, Eduard Bernstein, a friend of Engels, published Evolutionary Socialism in 1899. His argument: Marx was wrong about immiseration. Workers weren't getting poorer, they were getting richer. Capitalism was adapting, not collapsing. So socialists should abandon revolution and focus on reforms, better wages, shorter hours, expanded democracy. Socialism would emerge gradually through the ballot box. This was revisionism, and orthodox Marxists attacked it viciously. Karl Kautsky, the leading Marxist theoretician after Engels, argued that capitalism's contradictions remained, that crisis was inevitable, that revolution was still necessary. Rosa Luxemburg, the brilliant Polish-German revolutionary, wrote devastating critiques showing how imperialism temporarily stabilized capitalism by exploiting colonies, but would ultimately fail. The debate split the socialist movement: reformists versus revolutionaries, gradual change versus rupture, democracy versus dictatorship of the proletariat, all claiming to be the true heirs of Marx. Then came 1914, World War I, the great test. For decades, socialists had said workers of the world would unite against war. The International would stand firm. The working class had no stake in nationalist conflicts. But when war came, the socialist parties of every major European country voted for war credits. German socialists supported Germany. French socialists supported France. The International collapsed overnight. Workers went to the trenches carrying Marx's writings in their packs and bayoneted other workers carrying the same writings. So much for proletarian internationalism. A few refused. Lenin in Russia, Luxemburg in Germany, Eugene Debs in America. They argued the war was imperialist, that workers should turn their guns on their own ruling classes, that the real enemy was at home. They were imprisoned, exiled, marginalized. Then, in 1917, everything changed. Russia collapsed under the strain of war. In February, spontaneous uprisings overthrew the Tsar. In October, Lenin's Bolsheviks seized power in a nearly bloodless coup, promising peace, land, and bread. For the first time in history, a Marxist party controlled a state. The problem? Russia was the last place Marx expected revolution. He'd said socialism would emerge from advanced capitalism. Britain, Germany, maybe America. Russia was backward, agricultural, barely capitalist at all. How could you build socialism without the material base capitalism created? Lenin's answer: you could skip stages if you had the right leadership. The Bolsheviks would use state power to rapidly industrialize, to create the working class that would then support socialism. It was Marx, but twisted, adapted, improvised for conditions Marx never anticipated. The Russian Revolution electrified the world. Suddenly, revolution seemed possible everywhere. Communist parties formed in dozens of countries. In Germany, Hungary, and elsewhere, workers' councils seized power, briefly before being crushed. The old order survived, barely, drowning revolutions in blood. But Russia endured. Through civil war, foreign intervention, famine, chaos, the Bolsheviks held on. By the 1920s, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics existed, a workers' state covering 1/6 of the Earth's land surface. Was it socialist? That depended on who you asked. By the mid-1920s, Lenin was dead, and Joseph Stalin was consolidating power. Stalin's version of Marxism bore little resemblance to anything Marx wrote. Forced collectivization of agriculture, killing millions. Rapid industrialization through terror. Show trials, purges, gulags. A vast police state where speaking the wrong word could mean death. Stalin claimed this was building socialism. He quoted Marx and Lenin constantly. He said the ends justified the means, that you couldn't make an omelet without breaking eggs. The party represented the working class. Therefore, whatever the party did was by definition in the working class's interest. Critics, and there were many, even among communists, said this was a betrayal. Trotsky, expelled from the Soviet Union, wrote brilliantly about how the revolution had been betrayed by a bureaucratic caste. The Mensheviks and other socialists said Lenin's coup had been a disaster from the start. Anarchists said this proved Marx was wrong about the state. Any state would become tyrannical. Meanwhile, Marxism spread. China in 1949, Mao Zedong led the Communist Party to victory after decades of civil war. Cuba in 1959, Castro and Guevara overthrew Batista. Vietnam, North Korea, Eastern Europe after World War II. Dozens of African and Asian countries adopted Marxist governments during decolonization. By the 1960s, something like 2 billion people lived under governments that claimed Marx as their inspiration. The Soviet Union was a superpower with nuclear weapons. China was industrializing rapidly. Revolutionary movements fought in Latin America, Africa, Asia. But here's the paradox. Almost none of these revolutions looked like what Marx predicted. They didn't happen in advanced capitalist countries. They happened in backward agricultural societies: Russia, China, Vietnam, Cuba. They weren't led by industrial workers. They were led by peasant armies, guerrilla fighters, revolutionary intellectuals. And what they built looked nothing like Marx's vision. Instead of the state withering away, it grew more powerful than ever. Instead of workers controlling production, bureaucratic parties controlled everything. Instead of freedom and abundance, there was dictatorship and scarcity. Why? Multiple reasons, and scholars still debate them. First, the material conditions were wrong. Marx said socialism required advanced capitalism's productive forces. You couldn't build socialism on poverty. But every successful Marxist revolution happened in poor countries trying to industrialize rapidly while under attack from wealthier capitalist powers. That meant authoritarian methods, militarization, sacrifice, not the free association of producers Marx imagined. Second, the vanguard party model. Lenin argued that workers needed a revolutionary party to lead them because they couldn't develop revolutionary consciousness spontaneously. But a vanguard party, once in power, had every incentive to maintain its position. The people who'd sacrificed everything for revolution weren't about to hand power to workers who might vote them out. The dictatorship of the proletariat became the dictatorship of the party. Third, siege mentality. Every Marxist revolution faced immediate attack: civil war, intervention, embargo, sabotage. The Soviet Union fought a brutal civil war. China endured Japanese invasion and civil war. Cuba faced American blockade and invasion attempts. Vietnam fought the longest war in American history. This constant warfare shaped everything. Democratic governance seemed like a luxury they couldn't afford. Paranoia and repression became standard. Fourth, the lack of blueprint. Marx never detailed what socialism would look like, assuming the working class would figure it out. But revolutionaries needed answers immediately. How do you organize production without markets? How do you prevent counter-revolution? How do you allocate resources? They improvised, often disastrously. Stalin's forced collectivization killed millions. Mao's Great Leap Forward killed tens of millions. The results were mixed, to put it mildly. The Soviet Union industrialized rapidly, transformed a backward country into a superpower, defeated fascism in World War II, achieved full literacy and employment, pioneered space exploration. It also killed millions through famine, terror, and gulags, crushed dissent, invaded its neighbors, and created a gray, oppressive society where cynicism was the only rational response. China lifted hundreds of millions out of poverty, became an industrial powerhouse, but did so through methods, Mao's campaigns, Deng's market reforms, that Marx wouldn't recognize as socialist. Vietnam won its independence, but adopted market mechanisms to develop. Cuba achieved universal health care and education, but remained poor and authoritarian, and the critique from the left was devastating. Socialists who opposed Stalin, Trotskyists, anarchists, democratic socialists, left communists, argued these weren't socialist states at all. They were state capitalist or bureaucratic collectivist, new forms of exploitation where the party replaced the bourgeoisie. Marx wanted workers to control their own labor. In the Soviet Union, they were told when to work, where to work, what to produce, just as under capitalism, but with worse results. The Western left fractured over this. Some remained loyal to the Soviet Union, defending every atrocity as necessary, or denying it happened. Others broke away, trying to imagine socialism independent of the Soviet model. The new left of the 1960s rejected both Soviet bureaucracy and Western capitalism, searching for a third way. Meanwhile, in the capitalist West, Marx's influence took different forms. Social democratic parties, claiming Marx but rejecting revolution, built welfare states. They used government power to redistribute wealth, provide health care and education, regulate capitalism. Scandinavia, much of Western Europe, these weren't socialist in Marx's sense, but they used his critique of capitalism to reform it. Academic Marxism flourished too. Scholars analyzed culture, ideology, alienation. The Frankfurt School examined how capitalism shaped consciousness. Gramsci wrote about hegemony and cultural power. Althusser developed structural Marxism. Dependency theorists explained underdevelopment. Feminist Marxists analyzed the intersection of class and gender. Marx's ideas permeated fields far beyond economics: sociology, anthropology, history, literary criticism, geography. You didn't have to be a communist to find Marx useful. His method, analyzing material conditions, class relations, how economic structures shape everything else, became fundamental to social science. But the political project was failing. By the 1980s, the Soviet Union was stagnant. Its economy couldn't keep up with the West. Its people were disillusioned. Eastern European satellites were restive. China was introducing market reforms that made a mockery of Marx's vision. In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. Eastern European communist governments collapsed like dominoes. In 1991, the Soviet Union itself dissolved. 74 years after the revolution, the world's first Marxist state ceased to exist. Francis Fukuyama declared the end of history. Liberal capitalism had won. All alternatives were dead. Marx's ideas seemed relegated to history books, quaint relics of a failed experiment. But history, as Marx himself understood, doesn't end. It transforms, adapts, returns in unexpected forms. The story wasn't over. In some ways, it was just beginning. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. The experiment that began in 1917 was over. Marxism-Leninism, the ideology that had shaped a century, seemed dead. Former communist countries rushed to embrace capitalism. China kept the Communist Party but adopted market economics. Cuba endured in isolation. North Korea became a hereditary dictatorship that had nothing to do with Marx's vision. The 1990s and early 2000s were capitalism's victory lap. The market would solve everything. Democracy and free enterprise would spread globally. History, we were told, had ended with capitalism triumphant. Then 2008 happened. The financial crisis, the worst since the Great Depression, shattered the illusion. Banks collapsed. Markets froze. Millions lost homes, jobs, savings. Governments bailed out the institutions that caused the crisis while ordinary people suffered. Inequality exploded. The recovery, when it came, flowed to the top while wages stagnated below. Suddenly, Marx was relevant again. Students who'd never heard of him started reading Capital. Das Kapital sales spiked. Courses on Marxist economics filled up. The man declared dead in 1991 was resurrected by capitalism's own crisis. Exactly the kind of crisis he'd predicted. Why? Because Marx's core insights about capitalism remain disturbingly accurate, even if his predictions about revolution haven't materialized. Take inequality. Marx said capitalism would concentrate wealth in fewer hands. He was right. Today, 8 people own as much wealth as the poorest half of humanity. 3.5 billion people. The richest 1% owns more than the bottom 90%. In America, wealth inequality is higher than at any point since the Gilded Age. This isn't a bug in capitalism. It's a feature. Capital accumulates. Those who own capital get richer. Those who only own their labor fall behind or consider automation. Marx said capitalism would replace workers with machines, creating technological unemployment and a reserve army of desperate workers. Look around. Robots replace factory workers. AI threatens white-collar jobs. Uber and gig economy companies turn workers into independent contractors with no benefits, competing against each other for scraps. Amazon warehouse workers are monitored by algorithms that push them to exhaustion. The technology changes, but the logic remains. Maximize profit by minimizing labor costs or alienation. Marx wrote about how capitalism alienates workers from their labor, from the products they make, from each other, from their own humanity. Modern work feels increasingly meaningless. People spend their lives in jobs they hate, creating things they don't need, for companies they don't care about, making money for people they'll never meet. The rise of bullshit jobs, positions that even the people doing them think serve no purpose, suggests Marx understood something profound about how capitalism shapes human experience or crisis. Marx said capitalism was inherently unstable, prone to booms and busts. The 20th and 21st centuries have proved this repeatedly. 1929, 1973, 1987, 2001, 2008, and smaller crises constantly. Each time, economists are surprised. Each time, governments intervene to save the system. Each time, we're told it's fixed. And each time, it happens again. Deregulate, boom, crisis, regulate, repeat. Marx would recognize the pattern, or globalization. Marx and Engels wrote in the Communist Manifesto about how capitalism creates a world market, how it batters down all Chinese walls, how it makes all nations dependent on each other. They wrote this in 1848. Today, we call it globalization, and it's exactly what they described. Capital flows across borders instantly. Supply chains span continents. Economic crisis in one country spreads globally. National boundaries matter less than class position or climate change. This one Marx didn't predict explicitly, but his method applies. Capitalism requires constant growth, constant expansion, constant consumption. It treats nature as a free resource to be exploited. It externalizes environmental costs, pollution, extraction, degradation, onto the public while privatizing profits. The result is ecological catastrophe. Climate change is capitalism's greatest crisis, and it reveals the system's fundamental irrationality, destroying the planet for quarterly profits. These insights make Marx valuable even if you reject his solutions. You don't have to be a communist to use Marx's analysis. Many modern economists, even conservative ones, acknowledge that Marx understood capitalism's dynamics better than most. But what about the solutions? This is where things get complicated. Marx's predicted revolution hasn't happened, at least not in the way he imagined. The working class in advanced capitalist countries hasn't risen up to overthrow the system. In fact, in many places, they've moved politically rightward, supporting nationalist and conservative movements rather than socialist ones. Why? Several reasons. First, capitalism adapted. Marx didn't foresee the welfare state, government programs that redistribute some wealth, provide social services, regulate working conditions. These reforms, won through working class struggle, took the edge off capitalism's worst features. Universal health care, public education, unemployment insurance, labor laws. These weren't gifts from capitalists. They were concessions forced by organized workers, but they made capitalism bearable enough that revolution seemed unnecessary. Second, imperialism. Lenin argued that capitalism survived by exploiting colonies, extracting wealth from the global south to enrich the global north. This created a labor aristocracy in wealthy countries. Workers who benefited from imperialism even as they were exploited by their own capitalists. Why revolt when your standard of living relative to the rest of the world is comfortable? The exploitation didn't disappear, it moved elsewhere. Third, consumerism and ideology. Marx underestimated capitalism's ability to shape consciousness. Modern capitalism doesn't just produce commodities, it produces desires, identities, meaning, advertising, media, entertainment. All work to convince people that happiness comes through consumption, that success means individual wealth, that there's no alternative to capitalism. The cultural hegemony is so complete that imagining alternatives becomes difficult. Fourth, the Soviet Union's shadow. The failure and brutality of 20th century communism poisoned the word socialism for generations. When people heard revolution, they thought gulags, not liberation. The actual historical attempts at socialism, whatever you think of them, made it harder to argue for trying again. But here's the thing. Capitalism's problems are getting worse, not better. Climate change threatens civilization itself. No market solution has emerged because solving it requires limiting growth and profits, the opposite of capitalism's logic. Inequality continues to rise. Automation will eliminate millions more jobs. Financial crises recur. Democracy itself is weakening as wealth translates into political power more directly than ever. And young people, especially in countries hit hardest by 2008 and its aftermath, are increasingly skeptical of capitalism. Surveys show majorities of young Americans view socialism favorably. Democratic socialists have won elections. Concepts Marx made central: class consciousness, exploitation, the critique of private property, are entering mainstream discourse again. This doesn't mean revolution is imminent. It means Marx's questions remain relevant. Who owns the means of production, and why? Who benefits from the current system? What kind of society do we want to build? These questions don't go away just because 20th century attempts at answering them failed. Modern Marxists take various approaches. Some still advocate revolution and workers' states. Others support democratic socialism, using elections and reforms to gradually transform capitalism. Some focus on specific struggles: labor organizing, anti-imperialism, climate justice, while keeping Marx's analysis as a framework. Others have moved beyond Marx entirely while acknowledging his influence. There are eco-socialists analyzing capitalism's destruction of nature, feminist Marxists examining how gender and class intersect, post-colonial theorists studying imperialism and development, scholars analyzing how race and capitalism are intertwined. All use Marx's method while adapting it to questions he didn't fully address. And there are critiques, serious ones that any honest engagement with Marx must acknowledge. Marx was wrong about the inevitability of revolution. Capitalism has proved more adaptable than he thought. The working class hasn't developed the revolutionary consciousness he predicted. National and ethnic identities have often proved stronger than class solidarity. Marx underestimated the importance of democracy. The dictatorship of the proletariat, even understood generously, is dangerous. Every attempt to implement it led to actual dictatorship. You cannot build a free society through authoritarian means. Marx's economics, while insightful, has problems. The labor theory of value is controversial. Many economists argue that value comes from subjective preferences and market dynamics, not just labor time. His prediction of capitalism's collapse through falling profit rates hasn't materialized the way he thought. Marx largely ignored gender, race, and other forms of oppression. His focus on class was too narrow. Capitalism intersects with patriarchy, racism, colonialism in ways he didn't fully explore. Later Marxists have tried to address this, but it's a gap in Marx's original work. And the environmental critique of Marxism is important. Traditional Marxism celebrated industrialization and conquering nature. Some argue socialism could be just as environmentally destructive as capitalism if it maintains the same growth-obsessed logic. Eco-socialists have tried to develop a green Marxism, but it requires going beyond what Marx wrote. So where does this leave us? What do we do with Marx in the 21st century? Here's one answer. Take what's useful, discard what's not, adapt what remains. Marx's method, historical materialism, analyzing how economic structures shape society, examining class relations and power, remains valuable. His critique of capitalism, its inherent instability, its tendency toward inequality and crisis, its alienating effects, still resonates. His vision of a society organized around human needs rather than profit still inspires. But we don't need to treat Marx as a prophet or capital as scripture. We don't need to replicate 20th century attempts at socialism. We can learn from those failures. We can imagine new forms of democratic, ecological, emancipatory politics that draw on Marx while moving beyond him. The fundamental question Marx posed remains: can we create a society where production serves human flourishing rather than profit accumulation? Where people control their own labor, where resources are shared rather than hoarded, where technology liberates rather than dominates? These aren't just Marx's questions anymore, they're ours. Climate change, automation, inequality, crisis. These demand answers. The old solutions haven't worked, but the problems haven't gone away. Marx didn't have all the answers. The 20th century proved that, but he asked the right questions. And in a world where 8 people own as much as 3.5 billion, where we're destroying the planet for profit, where billions work their lives away while a tiny elite accumulates unimaginable wealth, those questions feel urgent again. Maybe Marx's greatest legacy isn't his specific predictions or solutions. Maybe it's the refusal to accept that the current system is natural, eternal, or inevitable. Maybe it's the insistence that we can understand how society works and change it. Maybe it's the conviction that another world is possible. He was wrong about much, but he was right about this. Capitalism is not the end of history. It's just another phase, another system that emerged from specific conditions and will eventually be replaced by something else. What that something else will be, whether it's better or worse, whether it's socialist or something we can't yet imagine, remains an open question. Marx can't answer it for us. Only we can answer it through struggle, experimentation, and the hard work of building alternatives. The specter is still haunting the world, not communism as the 20th century knew it, but Marx's questions, his method, his refusal to accept exploitation as inevitable. That ghost won't be exorcised until we've answered the questions he raised, or until capitalism destroys us first, which is also a possibility Marx would have understood. So who was Karl Marx? A philosopher who abandoned philosophy for economics. An economist who wasn't interested in markets, but in power. a revolutionary who spent most of his life in libraries, a man who wrote about liberating the working class while depending on a capitalist's money to survive, a theorist of historical forces who couldn't manage his own household, a prophet of revolution who died in obscurity. He was all of these things: contradictory, flawed, brilliant, obsessive. He sacrificed his health, his family's well-being, and any chance at personal comfort for an idea that we could understand how society works and change it fundamentally. Was it worth it? That depends on who you ask and when you ask them. To the millions who died in gulags, show trials, and forced collectivizations carried out in his name, no. To the workers who won 8-hour days, weekends, and labor rights by organizing around his ideas, yes. To the scholars who use his methods to analyze culture, economics, and power, absolutely. To the reformers who built welfare states partly in response to his critique, maybe. To the revolutionaries still fighting for a different world, the jury's still out. Marx's legacy is impossibly tangled. He inspired both liberation movements and totalitarian states. His ideas helped end colonialism and justify new forms of oppression. He gave workers a language to understand their exploitation, and intellectuals a framework to analyze society. He predicted capitalism's crises with uncanny accuracy, and revolution's inevitability with complete inaccuracy. The 20th century tried to build Marx's vision and created something he wouldn't recognize. The Soviet Union industrialized rapidly, but through terror. China lifted hundreds of millions from poverty, but abandoned core socialist principles. Cuba achieved universal literacy while remaining impoverished and authoritarian. Every attempt to implement Marx's ideas at scale resulted in states he would have criticized using his own framework. Does this mean Marx was wrong? Or that the attempts were flawed? Or that the circumstances were impossible? Scholars still argue. What's clear is that the gap between Marx's vision and what was built in his name is vast. Yet here we are in the 21st century, and Marx won't go away. Every financial crisis brings renewed interest in his work. Every widening of inequality makes his critique feel relevant. Every new form of automation threatening jobs recalls his warnings. Every climate report showing capitalism destroying the planet echoes his analysis of capital's short-sighted logic. The questions he raised remain unanswered. If wealth concentrates inevitably at the top, what do we do about it? If economic crises recur systematically, can capitalism be stabilized? If work is increasingly meaningless and alienating, what kind of society do we want? If we're destroying the planet for profit, how do we stop? Marx offers one set of answers. Transform the system entirely. Put production under democratic control. Organize society around human needs rather than profit. These answers terrify some people and inspire others. They've been tried and failed catastrophically. Does that mean they're wrong forever, or just that they were tried badly under terrible conditions? We don't know. That's the honest answer. We don't know if democratic socialism could work. We don't know if markets and private property are ultimately compatible with sustainability and justice. We don't know if capitalism can reform itself sufficiently to address its contradictions. We're living through the experiment in real time. What we do know is that ignoring Marx's questions won't make them disappear. Dismissing his analysis because of Stalin or Mao is intellectually lazy. You can reject his solutions while acknowledging his diagnosis. You can critique his blind spots while using his method. You can learn from the 20th century's failures while taking seriously the problems Marx identified. Because those problems are getting worse. Inequality is rising. Climate change is accelerating. Democracy is weakening as wealth buys political power. Automation threatens massive unemployment. Financial crises keep happening. These aren't marginal issues or temporary problems. They're systemic contradictions that capitalism has not resolved. Marx would understand what we're facing. He'd recognize the patterns: capital accumulation, crisis, the search for new markets and cheap labor, the conflict between private profit and social needs. He'd probably be frustrated that it's taken this long for his predictions to seem obviously correct to more people. But he'd also recognize what he got wrong. The revolutionary subject he expected, the industrial working class of advanced capitalism, didn't materialize the way he thought. National and ethnic identities proved more powerful than class consciousness. Capitalism adapted in ways he didn't foresee. The welfare state, consumer culture, imperialism, these gave the system breathing room. If Marx were alive today, he'd be back in the library, studying climate science, digital technology, financialization, globalization. He'd be analyzing how capitalism has changed and what new contradictions have emerged. He'd be arguing with other leftists about strategy and theory. He'd probably be on Twitter getting into fights with everyone. And he'd be insisting, as he always did, that we can understand the world in order to change it. That's his core legacy. Not any specific prediction or policy, but the conviction that social systems are human creations that can be transformed through human action. Whether you agree with his solutions or not, that conviction matters. The alternative, accepting that this is as good as it gets, that inequality and crisis and alienation are just natural features of human existence, is a kind of death. It's giving up on the possibility that we can collectively shape our future. Marx refused to give up. Even in poverty, exile, illness, and obscurity, he kept working. He kept believing that understanding capitalism's laws of motion would help people overcome it. He was arrogant about this, sometimes insufferably so. He was cruel to people who disagreed. He was difficult, demanding, and often wrong. But he tried. He dedicated his life to a project larger than himself. He asked the big questions. He refused easy answers. He insisted on rigor and evidence while maintaining revolutionary vision. That combination, critical analysis plus utopian hope, is rare and precious. The world Marx was born into is gone. Prussian monarchies, British Empire, the whole 19th century order he knew has vanished. The world he tried to help create, the communist society he imagined, never arrived. The 20th century's attempts left bitter legacies, but capitalism is still here, still generating the contradictions he analyzed, still creating crisis alongside wealth, still concentrating power while socializing production. The fundamental tension Marx identified between capitalism's socialized production and private ownership remains. What happens next is up to us. We can continue on the current path and see where it leads. We can try to reform capitalism sufficiently to address its worst features. We can attempt new forms of democratic socialism, learning from past failures. We can imagine alternatives Marx never considered. What we can't do is pretend the questions don't exist. What we can't do is assume capitalism is eternal. What we can't do is accept that 8 people owning as much as half of humanity, that destroying the planet for profit, that massive unemployment from automation, that recurring crises, that all of this is just how things have to be. Marx's ghost haunts us because he insisted on asking why. Why does it have to be this way? Who benefits? Who suffers? What would it take to change? These are dangerous questions. They threaten people invested in the current system. They inspire people oppressed by it. They've led to both liberation and tyranny, but they won't go away. On March 14th, 1883, Karl Marx died in his armchair in London. 11 people attended his funeral. The world barely noticed. The obituaries were short. The revolutionary movement he dedicated his life to seemed to be going nowhere. But ideas have their own life cycle. They lie dormant, then resurface when conditions are right. Marx's ideas, his critique of capitalism, his analysis of class, his vision of a different world, planted seeds that would grow in unexpected ways. A century and a half after his death, billions of people live with the consequences of those ideas, for better and worse. Billions more live under capitalism, still generating the contradictions he described. And millions are still reading his work, still arguing about what it means, still trying to figure out if he was right. The verdict isn't in. History hasn't ended. The experiment continues. Karl Marx was a man who tried to understand the world in order to change it. He failed in his lifetime. The question remains whether his ideas will ultimately fail too, or whether some future generation will succeed where the 20th century failed. Building a society that lives up to the vision of human liberation he articulated. We don't know. We can't know. We're still living in the world Marx analyzed, still grappling with the questions he raised, still searching for answers he didn't provide. The specter is still haunting us. Not the specter of communism Marx wrote about in 1848, but the specter of his questions, his method, his refusal to accept that exploitation and crisis are eternal. As long as capitalism exists, Marx will remain relevant. As long as inequality persists, his critique will resonate. As long as people ask whether another world is possible, his ghost will haunt us. And perhaps that's enough. Perhaps Marx's legacy isn't any specific answer but the insistence on asking, the refusal to accept that this is all there is, the conviction that we can understand our world and, understanding it, change it. In the end, that conviction, more than any economic theory or political strategy, may be Karl Marx's greatest gift and his most dangerous idea. The story of Karl Marx ends here, but the story his life set in motion continues. Where it leads is still being written by us. Right now, whether we know it or not, workers of the world, the rest is up to you.